In 1958, a rifle rolled off a factory line in Belgium that could be dropped in mud, dragged through rivers, and still fire the next day. Over 65 years later, many are still in military service. That's not nostalgia. That's engineering built to last. The greatest rifles weren't always made where you'd expect, and many of the companies behind them no longer exist. Their stories reveal what truly makes a rifle legendary: reliability, durability, and smart design, not flashy branding. After World War II, militaries realized outdated rifles couldn't meet modern combat demands. They introduced strict testing for mud, sand, freezing conditions, interchangeable parts, and real-world accuracy. Those standards created the golden age of military rifles, designs built to keep working no matter what. Let's get into the list. Number 7. The Steyr AUG. Say the name Steyr to most people and you get a blank stare, which is exactly the problem. This is an Austrian company that, in 1977, did something almost nobody else was willing to risk. It put the action behind the trigger instead of in front of it, folded the whole rifle in on itself, and handed soldiers something that looked like it had arrived from 20 years in the future. The bullpup layout let Steyr build a rifle with a full-length barrel in a package almost a foot shorter than its rivals. That is not a cosmetic trick. In a doorway, in the back of a vehicle, in a trench, that missing foot of length is the difference between moving freely and getting your rifle caught on something at the exact wrong moment. Steyr was never a household name outside Austria, and it never chased one. It quietly became the standard rifle of the Austrian, Australian, and Irish militaries, among others, while the loudest brands in the industry kept doing interviews. Here's the watchdog lesson buried in that. The company willing to redesign the entire shape of a rifle, instead of just reskinning the same old layout, is usually the one actually solving problems. The brand shouting the loudest is rarely the one taking the biggest engineering risk. Number 6. The Sig SG 510. Pull up a picture of this rifle and you'll notice something odd immediately. It doesn't look like it's trying to sell you anything. No flashy lines, no aggressive angles. Just a clean, almost severe Swiss rifle that looks built by people who assumed you'd already know what you were looking at. Sig built the SG 510 around a roller-delayed locking system, a mechanically elegant way of managing the violence of firing without relying on heavier, simpler parts other designs leaned on. The result was a rifle so precisely made that surplus examples, decades later, still shoot tighter groups than plenty of rifles built last year. Switzerland never needed to sell these to the world. Its own famously well-armed citizen militia was the entire customer base. And Swiss quality control has never been a marketing phrase, it's simply how the country operates. Which is exactly why almost nobody outside Europe has heard of a rifle that quiet collectors consider one of the finest pieces of precision manufacturing to ever come out of a rifle factory. A country that never had to advertise built one of the best rifles nobody was ever trying to sell you. Number 5. The Fabrique Nationale, FAL. Now the true heavyweights start walking into the room. Nicknamed the right arm of the free world, during the Cold War, the FAL wasn't just adopted by one army trying to make a statement. It was adopted, in some version, by over 90 countries. That is not a rifle that won a contract. That is a rifle that won an era. Belgium's Fabrique Nationale built it to be rugged, adaptable, and chambered for a full-power cartridge, at a time when militaries were beginning to argue about whether smaller rounds might be the future. The FAL was the last great rifle built on the old philosophy. Bigger cartridge, heavier steel, built like it needed to survive a war that might last another 10 years. Pick one up and the weight tells you everything before you ever pull the trigger. This was not a rifle built to a price point. It was built to a standard, and NATO countries who couldn't agree on almost anything else during the Cold War could agree that this was good enough to bet their soldiers' lives on. That kind of consensus doesn't happen from marketing. It happens from a rifle simply refusing to fail. Number 4. The Heckler Koch G3. While FN was perfecting the old philosophy, a small West German company was proving you could build something almost as tough for a fraction of the manufacturing cost. The G3 used stamped sheet metal and that same roller-delayed system, and it turned out you didn't need machine precision on every single part to build a rifle that would run for 50 years without complaint. This is the rifle that quietly became one of the most widely produced military rifles in history, licensed and built in over a dozen countries, from Pakistan to Iran to Mexico, long after most people assumed it was obsolete. Heckler & Koch wasn't chasing headlines. It was solving a manufacturing problem, and the solution turned out to be so good that armies kept building it under license, decades after its Cold War rivals had been retired. The lesson here is one the audio and camera world would recognize instantly. The manufacturing shortcut isn't always the compromise. Sometimes the cheaper-to-build version is actually the smarter engineering, and the fancier, more expensive competitor is just the one with better marketing. Number 3. The Galil. If the others on this list are respected, this one is closer to folklore among the people who actually study small arms. Israel built the Galil after the 1967 war exposed brutal problems with its existing rifles in sand and dust. And instead of starting from nothing, Israeli engineers studied the most battle-proven action on Earth at the time and adapted it to their own needs. What came out the other side was a rifle so reliable in sand, grit, and neglect that it became something close to mythology among special forces units worldwide, even ones that never officially adopted it. Finding a genuine, unmodified early Galil today is difficult, and the collectors who track them down treat it the way vintage watch collectors treat a lost reference number. Here's what makes it a perfect example. The Galil wasn't born from ego or national pride. It was born from a battlefield failure, brutally honest engineers, and a refusal to let the next generation of soldiers inherit the same problem. That kind of humility, admitting the old rifle failed and rebuilding from the ground up, is exactly what's missing from most of what gets marketed to you today. Number 2. The M14. Say M14 to anyone who studies this era, and watch their expression change. This is the rifle with the most complicated legacy on the entire list, because depending on who you ask, it was either America's last great battle rifle, or one of the most expensive engineering mistakes the US military ever adopted. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere in between, and that tension is exactly what makes it so fascinating. The story starts in the early 1950s, when the US Army looked at its inventory after World War II and saw a mess. There was the M1 Garand, a rifle that had won a world war but only fed from an 8-round clip and couldn't switch to automatic fire. There was the Browning automatic rifle, a squad support weapon that was powerful but heavy and slow to reload. There was the M1 carbine, handy but underpowered. Army planners looked at this patchwork and decided the answer was to replace all of it with one single rifle that could do everything those older guns did: standard infantry rifle, squad automatic weapon, and designated marksman rifle, all in one design. On paper, that's an elegant solution. In practice, it's one of the hardest engineering problems in the history of small arms, because the qualities that make a good automatic weapon and the qualities that make a good precision rifle are frequently at war with each other. The M14 emerged from that effort in 1957, essentially a modernized, select-fire evolution of the Garand, feeding from a 20-round detachable box magazine, and chambered in the newly adopted 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge, a full-power round with genuine long-range stopping power. And almost immediately, the cracks started to show. Fired on automatic, the M14 was so powerful and so light relative to that cartridge that it became nearly uncontrollable, climbing off target after the first shot or two. Soldiers in Vietnam quickly discovered that in dense jungle terrain, at close range, in dense brush, a lighter, higher-capacity rifle, chambered in a smaller round, was simply more practical for the kind of fighting they were actually doing. Meanwhile, the rifle America had built to replace 3 older designs at once was more expensive to manufacture than any of them, using machined steel and walnut furniture at a moment when the rest of the world was already moving towards stamped steel and synthetic materials. By 1964, barely 7 years after it was formally adopted, the Pentagon had already begun the process of replacing the M14 as the standard infantry rifle with the M16. For a rifle intended to serve as America's do-everything solution for a generation, that is an almost brutally short reign. Any honest telling of the M14 story has to include that failure, because pretending otherwise does the rifle a disservice. It really was, in the specific role it was designed for, replaced faster than almost anything else on this list. Number 1. The Kalashnikov AK-47. This is the king, and if you've made it this far, you already knew it was coming. Released in the late 1940s, refined for years afterward, and eventually produced in numbers that no other rifle in history has come close to matching, the AK-47 didn't win because it was the most accurate or the most refined. It won because it would fire after being buried in mud, dropped in a river, and left without cleaning for months, and it would do all of that being built by a factory with minimal tooling and minimal skilled labor. That is the entire genius of it. Mikhail Kalashnikov didn't design the most elegant rifle in the world. He designed the rifle that could be built by the most people, maintained by the least trained soldier, and survive conditions that would destroy almost anything else on this list. Loose tolerances weren't a flaw. They were the entire point, because a loose-fitting part still cycles when it's caked in dirt, and a tight, precise part jams. The AK-47 became the most produced rifle in human history, and it did it by rejecting almost every assumption the other 6 rifles on this list were built around. It wasn't the most refined. It was the most unstoppable. And there's a difference between those two things that the entire firearms industry is still arguing about. So what does all of this mean for you, looking at this list today? The lesson is the same one that shows up whenever something is actually built to last, instead of built to sell. The loudest brand isn't always the best engineering. The obsolete design sometimes has a second life nobody predicted. And the humble, unglamorous solution frequently outlasts the expensive, elegant one. These rifles were built by people solving real, brutal problems, not by people trying to win a marketing meeting. And that's exactly why we're still talking about them this many decades later.